She needs a date to her best friend's gala. He wants to settle down. Can they get past their hang-ups to see that they should be together? This is the premise of The Accidental Swipe by me, Y.M. Nelson. This steamy contemporary romance features Jason and Fortune, two people who've given up on love and are urged to use an online dating app to find someone. When they find each other, the attraction is undeniable, but their jaded outlooks on love based on past emotional hurt may keep them from getting together. The Accidental Swipe releases on July 25th, 2023. Go to ymnelson.com for all of the latest details. This is the Nerdy Romantics Podcast, and I'm your host, Y.M. Nelson. This episode is about romance novels. I'm going to answer all of your questions that you may have been a little bit embarrassed to ask in front of friends. This episode is mainly for readers, but yes, it's also for writers as well, because I'm going to break down a lot of genre categories, talk about the difference between romance and women's fiction, why Nicholas Sparks is not romance. Sorry to burst your bubble on that one. And acronyms and those terms that you see in romance descriptions that you may not have seen anywhere else. What does it all mean? Before we do that, though, I encourage you to go to ymnelson.com/subscribe and subscribe to the Nerdy Romantics newsletter, which comes out monthly. You will have all of the show notes complete with links for books and authors that we discuss on the show, plus a few extras, including giveaways. And one giveaway, which I'm doing right now, is a copy of my latest story, Stardate, a geek romance where Brandon and Phoenix find a mutual love in Star Trek and each other. So let's get into this. Why did I want to do an episode like this? Well, my friends and I have talked books a lot on and off the podcast. And you probably realize here that they read widely, not just in romance. So if they don't know a few of those genre-specific terms, I give them a pass, because after all, they're not romance writers. But one day I mentioned that I really like a cinnamon roll hero, and they got all dramatic, like, cinnamon roll? What? What are you talking about? Is this some kind of pastry thing that we need to figure out? And then I thought, it might be a good idea to possibly do a show where I talk about what some of these terms are. Because if they're anything like you readers out there, you may not know what these terms are, and a lot of writers are using them in book descriptions. So I wanted to break down what some of those terms were, and kind of at the same time I was thinking about what people thought about my writing, especially considering that some of my audience I found were new to romance novels. So I thought about that, and I asked a few social media groups that I'm in, what are some terms that are used in romance that you may not understand or that you're confused about? And I got quite a few, but I also got an interesting answer to my question from a chick lit rom-com author. Yes, an author. She said, everything confuses me, really. And I thought, wow, so many people, when they pick up a romance novel, really don't know exactly what they're picking up. They may think that they know, but they are not sure. There's a lot in romance to understand. It's not just a bodice ripper cover and, people having sex and that's what it's all about. That's not everything that romance is about. It's a very wide category with a lot of subcategories underneath and a lot of different descriptions and explanations. So if you don't know what you're reading is even a romance, how are you going to find a romance? Let's start off and talk about what romance actually is. Because a lot of people are not exactly sure that what they're reading is an actual romance novel. Why are people arguing on Twitter if Nicholas Sparks is romance or not? He's not. And then why is one of the most famous love stories that out there, Romeo and Juliet, why would that not be considered a romance? All boils down to the definition of what a romance is as far as a romance novel. What is it? A romance novel has to have two things. And this was really eye-opening for me because at the time that I found this out, that I was told what a romance novel had to be, I had finished writing this 70,000, almost 80,000 word manuscript that I was trying to query as a romance novel. In other words, I was trying to get agents to pick it up and to sell it to publishers. And I was querying it as a romance novel. And when I found out these two rules about what a romance novel is supposed to be, I realized that these 70 to 80,000 words, while they did have a love story in them, it was not a romance novel. This was very eye-opening to me. And so this is why this episode is not just for readers out there, although I'm going to try to talk specifically to readers and talk as a reader and a lover of romance. But this is also for those writers out there who may not be sure exactly what their writing could be classified as. So a romance novel has two rules. The first rule, all romance novels have to have as the central plot, in other words, the main story, the main plot is how your main characters find each other, get together. Okay? So let's let that sink in. If it was taken out that these two people or these how many ever people or this alien and this human, whatever you're writing, if these main characters are not getting together in a love relationship, if you took that out of your story and it still could stand on its own as a story, then you don't have a romance because that is everything. That is the main plot of it. The second thing is that you have to have a happily ever after or a happy for now. The acronyms HEA, HFN, that's what that means. The story has to end and they lived happily ever after. It doesn't necessarily have to say those words like fairy tales do, but that's how your romance ends, in a happily ever after, or at least they're happy for now. So those are the two rules. That's it. But that's everything, right? And so that is also why there are a couple of good love stories out there, or big love stories out there that are not romance. Romeo and Juliet is not a romance. Why? It doesn't have a happily ever after. Can't have a happily ever after if they're dead. So what we call Romeo and Juliet, well, Romeo and Juliet is a play, of course, so it's a little bit different. Plays are divided into comedies, dramas, tragedies, historicals. So Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy, but it's a romantic tragedy because it does have a love story there, and a lot of the plot is about the love story. but it doesn't end in a happily ever after. So it's not a romance if it was a novel. Nicholas Sparks says this on his website. He does not write romance. He writes what he calls love stories. So how I would describe them, or as a writer, if he was an indie author, like he had to go out and publish his own work, I would say a lot of his books fall in the category of women's fiction. And the reason why I say that is because of the definition of women's fiction. So women's fiction is different from romance. Women's fiction is a big genre. It doesn't have to have romantic elements in it. Some women's fiction does have romantic elements in it. Hence the manuscript that I was trying to market as a romance. It's actually women's fiction with romantic elements. So the difference between romance and women's fiction is the central plot. So the central plot of women's fiction is that the main character, who for most publishers and most of the publishing industry out there, the main character of women's fiction usually identifies as a woman. According to the Women's Fiction Writers Association, the main character doesn't have to identify as a woman, but the main character in every instance has to go through an emotional journey throughout the book. That's the central plot of a women's fiction book. They start off in one place emotionally, and they go through a whole arc, an emotional arc through the book. And so they end up in another whole place emotionally. They have maybe a realization of who they are. Maybe they have a transformation of who they are as far as an emotional transformation. But they start in one place emotionally, and by the end, they are in another place emotionally. That's the difference between romance and women's fiction. It's what your central plot should be. Obviously, love is an emotion. So there are a lot of women's fiction books that have romance in them, but not all of those women's fiction books have romance in them. And because we experience more than just one emotion, there are a lot of different categories of women's fiction books. Of course, we won't get into all those categories here. We just want to make sure that you know the difference. So when we're talking women's fiction, if you're thinking, well, what authors are those? In my opinion, Nicholas Sparks writes a lot of women's fiction with romantic elements. He may not say that, but, genre-wise, if I'm looking at it as an author or as a publisher, he would be writing a lot of women's fiction with romantic elements. He calls what he writes love stories. But if I'm going into a bookstore, I'm looking for a Nicholas Sparks book, it should be in the general fiction section. If that bookstore is really cool and they have a women's fiction section, it should be in the women's fiction section. If it's in the romance section, it's not categorized correctly. So people like Jennifer Weiner, Liane Moriarty, Celeste Ng, Camille Pagan, Denny Bryce, these are women's fiction authors, and you'll see that their books, while some of them may have romance, some of them may not have romance in them. And that's also where chick lit kind of comes in. Chick lit kind of was a little bit of the start of women's fiction. Women's fiction grew from chick lit. Back in the 90s, I would say, there were a lot of books that came out that maybe had some romantic elements in them, but they didn't end in happily ever afters. And it was really about, the women or the main characters going through emotional journeys. Books like Waiting to Exhale, Emily Giffin books like Something Borrowed, those kinds of books, while they may have had a romance element in them, they were really about these characters or these main characters being in one place emotionally and then going to another place emotionally. That's where the bigger women's fiction genre kind of started with chick lit. And chick lit is still out there, is still alive and well. I feel like chick lit is a part of, or is like a subcategory under women's fiction. Women's fiction is such a large category that I think chick lit is kind of a part of that women's fiction category. It has a lighter tone. Some women's fiction can be very serious, and because emotions are really serious, and there's some really heart-wrenching emotions and heart-wrenching situations that we deal with. But for chick lit, to me, it's about the tone. It's women's fiction that's a little bit lighter, a little bit less serious in tone, and has a fun element to it. Hence the illustrated covers. So now that chick lit kind of has a resurgence, because it was hot in the 90s and not so hot in the early 2000s, but now it has kind of a resurgence. What romance has done for those lighter, funnier romances, those rom-coms have kind of adopted that illustrated cover. So you see a lot of rom-coms or things that are categorized as romance. You see them with those same illustrated covers that maybe Confessions of a Shopaholic by Sophie Kinsella has as a chick lit book. So it's because of the tone, and it's because of the evolution of both romance and the explosion of women's fiction, and the fact that women's fiction is a lot more than just a chick lit novel. So that is a lot of what romance is and what romance isn't. So now that we know what romance is, you probably have realized that this is pretty specific and it's pretty formulaic, right? We know basically what the whole plot is, people getting together, and we know what the end is going to be, right? We know it's going to end in a happily ever after. So why aren't all romances the same? Why is this such a huge genre, right? Because it's not just about the formula. The formula is almost kind of like a safety. I know when I'm going in, I'm not going to cry my eyes out because the main characters have both died, like Romeo and Juliet, right? So I have a little bit of an escape. But think about it this way. Love doesn't come in one box. It doesn't come in one size. It doesn't come in one color. Love is varied. It's as varied and as individual as we are. And so that's why all the romance categories are out there. That's why all the subgenres are out there. Because think about it. We like what we like, and not everybody likes the same thing. If everybody liked the same thing, we'd be in a whole lot of trouble. I'm a big Trekkie, y'all. There is an episode of Star Trek where Wesley falls in love for the first time, and he's gotten his heart broken. He was like, I'm never going to feel that way again. Guinan, the ship's bartender, he was like, no, you're not going to feel that way again, because each time you fall in love is different. Each experience is different. And that's a lot of why romance has all these different parts to it and all these different things. You like what you like, but not everybody likes the same thing that you like. So you've got to find what you like. So here are some things that you need to know when you're picking a romance, or if you're a writer, how you categorize what you're writing so that the readers that you want can find the books that they want. I'm going to talk about two big parts of romance and where all these acronyms and stuff come from. The characters, or the hero and heroine, and the relationships or the love story. So there are a lot of different kinds of characters out there, and there are a lot of different kinds of love relationships that you can be in. So let's get into characters. I had a lot of questions about acronyms here. First off, there are the big H / little h. You see a lot. The H and H have this great relationship. And you're wondering, what in the world is that? So the big H and the little h are hero and heroine. Legacy-wise, back in the old days, the big H, it means hero because the hero was usually the guy. And the little h was heroine because heroine is usually the girl. But in this 21st century, the H and H are basically your main characters, your hero and your heroine. I tend to see it as the big H is your main character. A lot of times you'll see books that are written from a certain character's perspective. And then they have their love interest come in, right? That's like the second main character. So whether that's, two women or a woman and a man or two men or, three people or, an alien and a human or a shifter and a witch, whatever that combination is, the big H, I see it as that's that main character, the one that really the book is really their book. And the smaller H is the other main characters that they meet and they get with. If you are reading a book that's in the BDSM lifestyle, the big H is the dominant character and the little h is the submissive character. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So what about all these other acronyms as far as heroes and heroines are concerned? Well, a lot of times you're going to see, especially in alternative lifestyles, you're going to see this is an MF romance or FF romance or MM romance or MFM romance or MMF romance or an FFM romance. So that signifies the gender identity of the main characters. Maybe it's the female in between the two males. Maybe it's two men in a relationship, in an FFM kind of relationship. There's two women, and one of those women also brings in a man in that relationship. So there's a lot of kind of combinations there when it comes to polyamory. Am I an expert in this? No, I'm not an expert in this. But those are kinds of different combinations you'll see out there. And then there are all these acronyms that have to deal with race. A lot of times, especially in American society, people want to know going in if they are reading a romance novel where any of the characters are of a different race than they are, or of the same race than they are. And that's for whatever reason. Again, people have their preferences. And so what a lot of authors do, especially a lot of indie authors, and especially if your cover doesn't necessarily suggest this, you will see, acronyms for race. If you see things like AM, that would mean Asian man. BW would mean black woman. WM would mean white man. AW would be Asian woman. You get what I'm saying here. So there are a lot of racial identifiers, especially if the romance is an interracial romance, but the cover doesn't necessarily come across as it's an interracial romance. Because a lot of people want to know what the race of the person is or the people are in the book when they are reading it. And then there are now a growing section of romances that have heroes that are plus size. A lot of this is about representation right now. Back in the day, there were a lot of romances novels out there that were white people that were slim and that were 20 something, and that was a lot of what you saw, and that was it. You only saw a few novels that had people of a different race or people of a different size. And now the representation, especially with indie authors on the scene, we're getting a lot more representation now. And that is awesome. At the same time, people want to see that representation in books. They want to pick up a book where they know that main character that's going to find love looks like them. For me, I love seeing a character, and I write those characters that look like me, because I don't necessarily see those characters in romance novels. So if I don't see them, I'm going to write them. And a lot of authors are out there just like me doing that, and have done that very well, because let's be honest, we all want love in some shape or form, right? We all want to be loved, and seeing that in a novel can be a very hopeful thing. It can be a very calming thing. It can be a very powerful thing. And so that's why the representation, that's why there are these racial identifiers out there on books, so that people know, hey, this is what this is about. And for people who don't want the whatever kind of book it is, they know this book is not for me. I'm not the audience for this book. And so that also pertains to size. So when you see, subtitles, a BBW romance, that means a big, beautiful woman. So this is going to be a plus size romance. In other words, the main character, if it's BBW, it's somebody who identifies as a woman, they are going to be plus size. It could be a BHM romance, big handsome man. So that means the male main characters in that book are going to be big handsome men, or they're going to be plus size men. Those are some of the acronyms that you see that may trip you up. So let's get into specific, when we talk about heroes, how about we do that? And even maybe heroines as well. Let's get into like personality types. I got a lot of questions on what is a cinnamon roll hero, what is a beta, what is an alpha. So I'm going to go over that really quickly. An alpha hero is basically that strong type A domineering personality. Sometimes they're called alpha holes because sometimes they're jerks and other things that I will not say on this podcast. But basically they're that dominating personality. They have that controlling, dominating personality about them. And they're probably a lot of times type A. They've got to have it a certain way or they're not going to have it at all. They run the show. They're the leader of the pack. Alpha. A beta hero is one that is secure in who he is. He's secure in his manliness. He is not afraid to talk about his feelings. So sometimes beta heroes are also cinnamon roll heroes. That has become interchangeable. But to me, a cinnamon roll hero is one that has that gooey inside, like the gooey inside of a good cinnamon roll. Sweet, loving, so nice. Basically, he used to be called the nice guy, but now he's called cinnamon roll hero. And a cinnamon roll hero is very in touch with his feelings. He's not going to have a dominating, kind of personality, but he may have kind of the exterior of a beta, right? He may have that beta kind of, I am down, I am ride or die, this is my woman kind of exterior. But inside, that whole feelings and emotions, he's not afraid to show those. So the beta hero is that strong, loyal, but, not afraid to say how he feels. And to me, the cinnamon roll goes a little more into the emotional. He's just a nice guy. He's chill. He's nice. He's in touch with his emotions. He's not afraid to, let that woman go off and do whatever she does. These also can apply as far as alphas. Yes, there are women alphas out there, and there are books that, now they're writing women alphas. These are mainly terms that are applied to heroes, though. So now that we've talked a lot about characters, and hopefully I've answered a lot of questions about acronyms, about characters, let's talk about the relationships, or let's talk about the love story. What's going to happen with these characters? So here's where we get into the big topic, heat level. What are the three flames? What does sweet and steamy mean? How can something be sweet and steamy at the same time? Well, I will start off by saying this. There is some, as far as the flames go, when people have the flames, there's some variation there. Romance writers don't have this like scale out there that I am aware of that says, okay, after this point, we are now in three flames. There are some definite markers between sweet and steamy, and from steamy to erotic. I should say here that there is a difference between erotic romance and erotica. So erotica is the main plot is not about people getting together into a love relationship like a romance is. The main plot is about the main character's sexual exploration. So erotica is about sex. Erotic romance is about romance with erotic sex in it. So yes, there's even that kind of differentiation. And that's why erotic romance may be something you can find on Amazon, but they don't like erotica necessarily right now, I should say. Back in the day, you probably could find it, but not all publishers or not all distributors want to distribute erotica, because erotica is about sex, and that's the main plot of it. It's about sexual exploration, whereas erotic romance is about romance. So let's talk about heat levels, okay? Between sweet with heat, steamy, and erotic, there are differentiations there. So again, not necessarily a scale like a ruler, but there are some definite key indicators that what you're reading is sweet versus steamy versus erotic. So when we think about a sweet romance is going to have a low heat level. This is where you'll find, when we talk about different categories, Christian romance is usually sweet, where you'll find Amish romances, inspirational. You're going to find sweet romances to have maybe kissing. Some have no kissing. Some have holding hands. Some have kissing and maybe touching, but not risque touching, and we're not talking a lot about the touching. You're definitely not going to see any sex on the page. In other words, you're not going to have open door sex in a sweet romance. And what I mean by open door sex, if you think about it, it's like having a couple's bedroom door open and you can see what's going on inside. So a sweet romance will maybe have kissing, maybe have some touching, but not any risque touching. And then if sex happens, sex is off the page. It's maybe the scene is ended and maybe the next day they are married or something. Again, there's a range there. It depends on what you're reading and in what context you're reading it, or what context the story is. So that's basically what sweet is. If you're thinking about it on a flame level, that's a little bit more nebulous because people, they see what they see. For me, if something is maybe a one flame or even maybe a two flames, it's probably going to be sweet. To me, two flames is probably what we call now sweet with heat. So it's also called sweet steamy, sweet dash steamy, and it's kind of that middle ground between sweet and steamy. I should probably also say with sweet romances, a lot of the language, and it just naturally goes like this. It doesn't really have to do with the sexual relationship on the page, but a lot of the language is going to be mild. You're not going to have cursing. You're not going to have people talking about their genitals in any kind of slang form. You're not going to have any quote-unquote locker room talk or dirty talk or whatever, even in a kind of funny way. That's usually not going to happen in a sweet romance. In something that's sweet with heat, or sweet dash steamy, you may find that. So you may find that the characters may say curse words, they may refer to their genitals, may do that with slang, they may make a dirty joke or two. You're definitely going to see kissing, you're going to see making out in a lot of sweet steamy romances. You may see the beginning of a sex scene, or you may see one sex scene, but it is described in kind of a poetic kind of way or in kind of a nebulous way. They're not specifically talking about what actually is happening. They are giving a general feeling of making love kind of thing. And a lot of times you're not going to see that on the page. A story that I recently reviewed, Accidentally Engaged by Farah Heron, I hope I didn't butcher her name, was what I would call sweet steamy or sweet with heat. Because, yeah, the main characters, they did curse. The main characters made out. A lot of foreplay happened, but no sex happened on the page. So even with sweet steamy and sweet with heat, there is a range there. My short story trilogy, Owen and Michaela trilogy, that I would consider sweet steamy because there's no actual sex on the page, but there are some things that happen before then that are on the page. So when we go from closed door to open door, that's when we move to steamy. So that's a definite indicator that we're at steamy level. Closed door, the door is closed. When we have open door sex, that means if you can envision the couple's bedroom door is open, you can see what's going on inside. Now, how it's described is the difference between steamy and erotic, and also how many times we see that in a book. So with a steamy novel, you may get 2 sex scenes that are open door. With an erotic novel, you're going to get at least 3 sex scenes that are open door. And how they're described is different as well. For a steamy novel, something like something like The Brown Sisters by Talia Hibbert, that trilogy, I would consider that steamy as far as the scenes because they are open door, but they are not intensely graphic. They're not major descriptions of biological things happening, for lack of a better word, and very specific acts happening. They're not graphically described. So if you think about it in a movie way, which, let's be honest, a lot of us writers, we think about it like that too. If I'm talking about something sweet, I'm talking about something that's rated PG. If I'm talking about something that's sweet, steamy, it's going to be rated PG-13 these days. If I'm talking about something that is steamy, it's going to be rated anywhere from PG-13 to R. If I'm talking about something that's erotic romance, that's going to be rated, NC-17. If you're thinking about it in like TV terms, a lot of times I think about it in TV terms as well. If I'm thinking about something sweet, that's going to be something that I can watch with my family. That's going to be like a Hallmark movie, which several of those are made from sweet romance novels. Something that they would show on regular broadcast television at 8 o'clock at night while the kids may be still up. If I'm thinking about sweet, steamy, that's going to be something that's shown still on regular broadcast television, but maybe a little bit later at night after the small kids have gone to bed. And if I'm thinking about steamy, I'm thinking about something that's going to be on HBO, something that's going to be on Showtime, something like an Outlander that's going to be on Stars. But if I'm thinking about, erotic romance, I'm thinking about something that's going to be on HBO really late at night, right? Not just Sex in the City. It's going to be something that's on really late at night, or something that may be a little bit more than that. So those are the kind of levels that we're kind of thinking. As far as heat levels, make sure you're reading those book descriptions. A lot of times a sweet romance will obviously have a sweet romance cover, and a steamy romance will have a different looking cover. But that's not always the case, especially with rom-coms. The Kiss Quotient is definitely a steamy rom-com. You would not know that by the cover. So, that's where when we say words like steamy or when you see those in descriptions, you'll know what they mean. You'll know what you're getting. When we talk about flames, as I was saying before, we may get 2 flames, maybe sweet, steamy. If we're talking 3 flames, that's going to probably start steamy, 3 and 4. And 5 flames, that's probably going to be erotic romance. If somebody says something is spicy, that's probably going to fall in that steamy category. There's going to be at least 1 or 2 open door sex scenes. When we talk about relationships, we also want to look at not just the heat level, but also the categories of romance, because some people like to read different kinds of romances. They want to read different settings. They want to see these people get together in different settings, in different time periods. Maybe they're not people at all. Romance, a lot of romance is about escape, as I said. So to have different categories of romance is to have different ways and different scenarios for people to escape and enjoy themselves. We already know it's going to be a happily ever after at the end. We know it's going to be that good feeling that we get. We're not going to walk away wrenched and thinking and feeling bad and wondering what life is going to be like and all that kind of stuff. We're going to get a good feeling. So why not just escape reality altogether in these books? That's why you have different categories of books. And this is where people can just live out their fantasies. When we talk about contemporary romance, anything that's 50 years or newer is contemporary. Anything where the setting is 50 years or more in the past, that's considered a historical romance. When we talk about paranormal romances, we're talking about romances with characters who are not exactly human or who aren't all human, right? So we're talking about beings like shifters, vampires, witches, warlocks, different kind of sorcerers, ghosts, those kinds of beings. So when we talk about fantasy romance, we're talking about romance with a fantasy element in it. So think, kind of a Lord of the Rings or a Chronicles of Narnia, but a romance. There's also sci-fi romances, aliens and otherworldly beings in romances. There's the rom-com sect, which we already talked about. There are MC romances. When you see MC, that's a fairly new genre. It means motorcycle club. They're going to be a lot of, guys and girls riding motorcycles and tattoos maybe and leather jackets, those kinds of things. When we talk about geek romances, they could be anything from any kind of nerd pop culture kind of romance. So if you think about Big Bang Theory, they were into all of those geeky things. Things like superheroes, Star Trek, Star Wars, any kind of nerd pop culture. Geek romance can also even go as far as, whatever somebody has an affinity for. Like maybe if they're gamers or if they like 80s TV. Those are things that people would geek out over. People getting together around geek culture or nerd culture. If you're talking about an ace romance, ASE, that means an asexual romance. So these people are getting into a love relationship, but they are asexual, right? So there's going to be no sex in that relationship. And then there's the whole sect of alternate lifestyles, polyamory, and BDSM. It seems like some of the worst representations of a genre get the most readership. But as far as BDSM goes, or even as far as polyamory goes, there are a lot of romance authors out there that are doing it a lot better than some of the more famous ones that you've seen. Two that come to mind right now for me are Sierra Simone and Sienna Snow. Katie Robert does it really well. That's Katee. Robert does it really well. My favorite is Sierra Simone. She does polyamory, that lifestyle very well. And she also does a very, very healthy representation of BDSM in American Queen and that new Camelot trilogy, but definitely in American Queen. And when we talk about BDSM, what does that mean? The B is for bondage, the D is for domination, the S is for sadism, and the M is for masochism. And so when you have a BDSM type relationship, there's going to be a partner who is dominant, and that partner is going to control things as far as sexual pleasure goes. And then you have a partner who is submissive, who will do what the dominant says as far as sexual pleasure goes. With BDSM, there has to be a complete trust that goes on there, and a complete understanding of what you are actually getting into before you go into it. And so to me, it's a big deal that is actually portrayed in a way that gives, okay, this is the healthy side of it, and okay, this is not the healthy side of it, so that people who don't know what it's about now know what it's about and understand that, because it's not really for everybody. As far as a novel goes, a true BDSM novel is going to have the dominant's name, or the dominant, the D in dom being capitalized, the S in submissive being lowercase. It's going to show the lifestyle even to that level, and it's going to do it well. And Sienna Snow actually does that pretty well as far as the writing part of it. And Sierra Simone, to me, as far as the healthy part of it, or showing the difference between a BDSM relationship and an abusive relationship, because they are not the same thing. And the new Camelot trilogy is is everything. So that's a pretty exhaustive list, I think, of things that you may not understand as far as acronyms and as far as romance genre specific terms in romance novels. And hopefully as readers, this will kind of help steer you to romance novels that really are what you want to read and not get drawn into something that you may not want to read just because somebody else recommends it. As writers, hopefully this helps you with marketing your romance novel and hopefully maybe realizing that it is a romance in my case and knowing how to market it where you get those readers that you want. So what other terms or what other things about romance novels have you always wondered about? Make sure to tweet me and use the hashtag Nerdy Romantics Podcast. I know hashtags are not as cool anymore, but hey, I'd like to see it and I'd like to know. Or leave a comment on my show notes for this episode. All of my show notes are at ymnelson.com. And let me know what romance terms or what things that are specific to romance novels that you may not understand, and I can cover those in another episode. So that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to Nerdy Romantics Podcast wherever you get your podcast to be notified anytime a new episode drops. And if you like what you're hearing, please rate and review. The links are in my show notes at ymnelson.com, along with a lot of other links for books and other items that we talked about on our show. And if you really like what you're hearing, click the Buy Me a Coffee button while you're there to support us. Thank you for listening.